God's sovereign will. Though God has created each of us with a free will, we are to acknowledge that He is sovereign over all aspects of His creation, including our personal lives. Here's Gene.
This principle, of course, focuses on God's sovereignty, and as I was thinking about that, I thought we need a couple of definitions. What does it mean when we talk about the fact that God is sovereign? Well, here's a definition from Dr. Norman Geisler. Sovereignty is God's control over His creation, dealing with His governance over it. Sovereignty is God's rule over all reality. Here's a definition by Dr. Charles Ryrie. The word means principal, chief, supreme. It speaks first of His position, that is, of God's position. Ultimately, God is in control of all things, though He may choose to let certain events happen according to natural laws which He has ordained. And from experience, we know that's true in terms of the natural laws that govern what happens in our universe and on our earth, in terms of earthquakes and tsunamis and storms and lightning and all of those things. But when all is said and done, God is ultimately in control. Now, at some point in time, Solomon came to the conclusion that God is indeed sovereign. That's one thing he got right. However, his conclusions, once again, have elements of distortion. So let's take a closer look at his conclusions. We have, first of all, what I've called the mystery of time. Ecclesiastes 3:1-3. There's an occasion for everything, and a time for every activity under heaven, a time to give birth, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build. And he goes on to list a number, actually 14 opposites in that list. But notice how he summarized this. Notice his conclusions. What does the worker gain from his struggles? I've seen the tasks that God has given people to keep them occupied. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity in their hearts, and those are true things. But man cannot discover the work God has done from beginning to end. And that's a true statement. But again, we see this inadequate conclusion, an inappropriate conclusion. And here's what he concluded: live life now. Since we don't understand it all, let's just live life now. And so he says in verses 12-13, I know there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. It is also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts. In other words, God has given us all these things to enjoy, and Solomon, put on no restrictions in relationship to the gifts of God. And he abuses them. In other words, Solomon seems to be saying, we cannot understand God's eternal perspective, even though we long to. So, eat, drink, and be merry. Enjoy as much of life as you can. Now, in view of God's sovereignty, that's a very inadequate conclusion. And you see, we're fortunate again, when we look at the whole of Scripture, there's no question that God is sovereign. That's a biblical truth. But here are observations that grow out of Solomon's life, and that is that knowing God is sovereign shouldn't lead us to pessimism. And you see pessimism throughout his life, at least towards the end of his life. It should not lead to irresponsibility. There's irresponsibility here for the decisions that he made. And he doesn't seem to be taking responsibility for it. It should not lead to a deterministic view of life, As Doris Day sang, Que sera, sera. What will be, will be. That's pessimism. That's a mechanistic view of life. The facts are, you see, Solomon is responsible for his bad decisions. And so are we. The decisions that Solomon made were not predetermined, those bad decisions were not predetermined by God. He made those decisions out of the will of God. And so, in this sense, though he had the idea of truth that God is sovereign, he still had a distorted view of God's sovereignty. And so the reflection and response question for us today is, what happens when Christians attempt logically and definitively and perhaps experientially to resolve this divine mystery regarding God's sovereignty and our free will? Now, Solomon was trying really to define it experientially to a great extent. And that led him to these false conclusions. And if we're not careful, even as Christians, we can come up with the conclusion that Solomon came up to: what will be, will be. And God never intended us to have that mindset, even though He's sovereign. The other thing is, if we get a wrong view, a distortion of God's sovereignty and our free will, we can become disillusioned. Solomon was disillusioned. And we can become disillusioned. We can become irresponsible. Solomon became irresponsible, even though he said God is sovereign. We can blame God for our bad decisions. I didn't have a choice. And I think Solomon may actually have been doing that. Yes, God is sovereign. No question about that. But we have a free will. We have a free will to make decisions that are in God's will. But we have freedom to make decisions that are out of God's will. And Solomon did that on a regular basis.